The dust motes danced in the slants of morning light, each one a tiny, carefree soul oblivious to the gravity of the day. Ilara Vance was anything but carefree. My stomach was a tight knot of anticipation, my palms damp against the coarse canvas of my satchel. Inside that bag lay 2 sharpened pencils, a lump of eraser, and the sum total of my hopes, all condensed onto a single precious admission ticket for the National University entrance examination. This was it. The day I had been working towards for 2 lifetimes. The first cut short by illness, this one now finally within my grasp. A year of relentless studying, of poring over textbooks by the guttering light of a kerosene lamp, of ignoring the whispers that I was a fool for trying again, all culminated in this walk down the familiar dusty track that led from our village to the county town. Beside me, chattering with a nervous energy that grated on my own quiet tension, was my best friend, Clara. Do you think they'll ask about the economic policies of the Tang dynasty? I dreamt about tariffs last night, Ilara. Tariffs. My brain is boiling over. I offered a faint smile, my eyes scanning the path ahead. The woods on either side were deep and shadowed, a place of childhood games and for me now, a looming sight of personal catastrophe. It was here 1 year ago that my life had veered catastrophically off course. Not today, I promised myself. Today I walk straight past this spot and into that examination hall. My fiancé, Kalen Thorne, was the reason for that first derailment. He was already a university student, the pride of our entire province. His letters, filled with descriptions of lecture halls and intellectual debates, were both a balm and a torment. They painted a picture of a world I ached to join. Our engagement was a promise that we would build a future together there, in that world of light and learning. He was home for a brief visit, and the plan was for us to travel back to the city together after my exam. He had even promised to quiz me on the way. A sharp cry, more of surprise than pain, sliced through the morning calm. It came from a cluster of birch trees just off the path. Clara and I exchanged a glance before hurrying towards the sound. And there he was. Kalen Thorne, slumped against the white bark of a tree, his face a mask of shock and pain. He clutched his right forearm, where a dark stain was already spreading through the fabric of his shirt. Kalen! Clara gasped, rushing to his side. A snake, he managed, his voice tight. It came out of the ferns. Struck before I even saw it. My blood ran cold. I didn't need to see the wound to know. Growing up in these foothills, you learn the signs. The specific panicked pallor, the way the body tensed not just with pain but with a creeping poison. I dropped to my knees, my satchel falling forgotten into the dust. "Let me see," I commanded, my voice surprisingly steady. He uncurled his fingers, revealing 2 clean, deep puncture marks, already angry and swollen. The skin around them was tinged with a livid purple. A viper. There was no doubt. Time seemed to warp, to slow and speed up all at once. The exam. The exam was in less than an hour. I could still make it if I ran. I looked at Kalen's face, beaded with sweat, his eyes wide with a fear he was trying desperately to master. He was the future. He was everything I had ever wanted. And in that moment the girl who loved him, who believed in duty and sacrifice, made her choice. "Clara, hold his arm steady," I ordered, my voice low and urgent. "Ilara, what are you?" she began, but I was already bending my head. The taste was foul, metallic blood, earth, and something else, something bitter and alien that coated my tongue and made me want to gag. I sucked hard at the wound, spitting the vile mixture onto the ground. Again and again I repeated the process, my head beginning to swim, my jaw aching with the effort. Kalen groaned, his body trembling. Clara watched, her face a pale moon of horror. When I finally sat back, dizzy and nauseous, the immediate frantic danger had perhaps passed, but the greater one remained. He couldn't walk. The venom was taking its toll. "We have to get him to the hospital," I said, my voice hoarse. "The exam," Clara whispered, her eyes darting towards the town. "The hospital," I repeated, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. I looked at the path leading to my future, then at the man I loved, who was now depending on me for his. There was no choice. Not really. Somehow, with Clara's help, we got him upright. He was heavy, his muscles already turning to lead. I took most of his weight on my back, my legs buckling under the strain. My satchel with its admission ticket lay in the dust. I didn't have a free hand to retrieve it. I left it there, a tiny, insignificant marker of a dream abandoned. The walk to the county hospital was a blur of agony. Every step was a battle against gravity and my own screaming muscles. The sun climbed higher, beating down on us. I could feel the precious minutes of the exam ticking away, each one a small death. Kalen drifted in and out of consciousness, his mumbled words nonsensical. Clara, for her part, was mostly silent, a silent, shocked witness to the unraveling of my life. At the hospital there was a flurry of activity. Nurses took Kalen from me, laying him on a gurney. I stood in the hallway, covered in dust and sweat, my dress stained, my body trembling with exhaustion. A doctor emerged some time later, his expression grave but reassuring. "You got the bulk of the venom out," he said. "It bought him critical time. He's stable. He'll make a full recovery thanks to you." The words should have been a comfort. They were a verdict. He would recover. I would not. In the days that followed, as Kalen slept off the poison and began to regain his strength, a different kind of sickness took hold of me. My throat, raw from the venom I'd ingested, began to swell shut. It was a terrifying sensation, the slow, inexorable closing of a passage I had always taken for granted. When the acute swelling finally subsided, after treatments that left me weak and drained, I discovered the permanent damage. My voice was gone. The most I could manage was a painful, airy whisper, a ghost of sound that cost me immense effort and left listeners straining to understand. Then came the final, crushing blow. A specialist, called in from the city, sat me down after a series of invasive examinations. His face was kind, his words careful. "The toxin," he explained gently, "it has caused significant scarring internally. I'm so sorry, Miss Vance. It is highly unlikely you will ever be able to bear children." The world went silent, and not just because I could no longer speak. It was as if all color and sound had been leached from the universe. I was a ghost, a hollow shell. I had sacrificed my future on the altar of a single moment, and the price had been my voice, my motherhood, my very self. Kalen's family, the Thorns, were initially effusive in their gratitude. His mother, Serafina, wept and held my hands, calling me her brave, selfless girl. His father, Alistair, declared me a heroine. Their gratitude felt like a cage. Our engagement, which had been a promise of a shared future, was now a debt to be repaid. The wedding was a quiet, rushed affair, devoid of the joy that should have accompanied it. It felt less like a beginning and more like a funeral for the person I had once been. I moved out of my parents' old cottage and into the Thorn household. While Kalen returned to the university, I stayed behind. I became the caretaker, the daughter-in-law, the mute shadow. I tended to Serafina's delicate health and Alistair's bad temper. I managed the household accounts, I cooked, I cleaned. I poured every ounce of my stifled ambition into Kalen's success. His good grades were my victory, his letters my window to the world I had lost. Life was a relentless, silent grind. The villagers' initial admiration curdled into pity, and then into a kind of disdain. I was a cautionary tale. The girl who had gambled everything on a man and lost. I endured the sidelong glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. I told myself it was for love. I told myself that my sacrifice had saved a life, that it had meaning. I built a fortress of duty around my broken heart and lived within its walls, waiting for the day Kalen would finish his studies and come home for good. Then I thought our real life would begin. I was building a foundation for us, or so I believed. I was merely polishing the chains that bound me, unaware that he was already forging the key to my final, absolute destruction. 5 years. 5 years of silence. 5 years of servitude. 5 years of watching the seasons change from the window of a house that never truly felt like a home. I had become proficient in the language of gestures and written notes. My world had shrunk to the dimensions of the Thorn property, its rhythms dictated by Serafina's migraines and Alistair's moods. Kalen's visits home were brief, dazzling interruptions, bursts of city energy and intellectual chatter that left me feeling more isolated than ever when he departed. He spoke of his professors, his friends, his ambitions, and I would listen, a silent, smiling statue, my own mind screaming with unasked questions and unshared thoughts. The letters were my lifeline, but even they began to change. They grew shorter, less frequent. The passionate descriptions of lectures were replaced by vague mentions of being terribly busy. He started talking about a friend, a fellow student named Clara. My Clara. He wrote how helpful she was, how she understood the pressures of university life in a way he couldn't explain to someone who hadn't been there. A cold dread, sharp as a shard of ice, began to form in the pit of my stomach. But I dismissed it. I was his wife. I had saved his life. We had a history, a bond forged in a moment of crisis. Then the letter came. It was thick, official. Kalen had graduated. Not just graduated but with the highest honors. He had been offered a junior professorship at the university itself. It was a staggering achievement, a triumph. Serafina wept with pride. Alistair puffed out his chest, boasting to anyone who would listen. And I felt a fragile, desperate hope unfurl within me. This was it. The reward for all the years of patience. He would come home now a successful man. He would send for me and I would finally leave this village and its ghosts behind. I would take my place beside him not as his silent caretaker but as his partner. I threw myself into a frenzy of preparation. I scrubbed the house until it shone, airing out rooms that had been closed for years. I spent the last of my personal savings, the small inheritance from my parents I had guarded so fiercely, on fabric for a new dress. I practiced speaking in front of the mirror, forcing my broken voice to form the words, "Welcome home, my love." Came out as a rasp, but it was the best I could do. The day of his arrival I woke before dawn. I put on the new dress, a soft blue that reminded me of the sky on the day we'd first met. I arranged a platter of his favorite sweets. I waited. The sound of a motor car, a rare sound in our lane, sent my heart into a frantic rhythm. I smoothed my dress, took a deep, shaky breath and went to the door. It opened and for a single heart-stopping moment I saw him. He looked older, more assured, handsome in a well-tailored city suit. The smile that began to form on my lips froze, then died. He was not alone. Standing beside him, her hand tucked possessively in the crook of his arm, was Clara. My Clara. Her face, once so familiar, was now a mask of smug triumph barely concealed beneath a veneer of sympathy. And in her other arm she held a child. A boy about 2 years old with a shock of dark hair and Kalen's unmistakable, piercing blue eyes. The world did not tilt, it shattered. It exploded into a million glittering shards, each one reflecting a different facet of my stupidity, my trust, my 5 years of wasted devotion. I stood rooted to the spot, my hand still on the doorframe, my useless voice trapped in my throat. "Alara," Kalen said. His tone was not warm, not loving. It was cold, formal, the way one might address a troublesome stranger. "We need to talk." They stepped past me into the house I had maintained for them, an invading force of betrayal. The scent of Clara's perfume, something floral and expensive, filled the familiar space, polluting it. The child stared at me with his father's eyes, and I felt a physical pain, a wrenching deep in the scarred emptiness of my womb. "Alara, I know this is a shock," Clara began, her voice the same gentle, reasonable tone she had always used. But now I could hear the razor's edge beneath it. "But we can't live a lie anymore. You have to know the truth." "The truth?" I tried to form the word, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. I shook my head, a frantic, desperate motion. My eyes pleaded with Kalen. "See her. See what she is doing." "The snake," Clara said, her gaze steady on mine. There was no guilt there, only a chilling resolve. "It was a grass snake, Alara. Mildly venomous at best. Kalen would have had a fever, perhaps some swelling. He would have been fine. You didn't need to suck the poison. You didn't need to miss your exam." No. It was a lie. A vicious, terrible lie. The doctors had confirmed it was a viper. They had praised my quick thinking. I looked at Kalen, begging him with my eyes to refute her, to defend the sacred story of our bond. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He stared at a point somewhere over my shoulder, his face a hard mask. "It all makes sense now, Alara," he said, his voice flat. "The timing. The dramatic sacrifice. I should have seen it. I married you out of pity and you've been clinging to me ever since." The words were physical blows, each one landing with brutal precision. Pity. Clinging. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. I didn't need to see it to know what it was. "I want a divorce," he said. A sound tore from me then, a raw, guttural croak of pure, unadulterated anguish. It was the sound of my soul breaking. My legs gave way and I crumpled to the floor at his feet. I clutched at the fine wool of his trousers, my body convulsing with silent, wrenching sobs. 5 years of silence, of service, of love, all poured out in this wordless, desperate plea. Clara knelt beside me, but it was not a gesture of compassion. She put her face close to mine, so close I could see the fine powder on her skin, the calculating coldness in her eyes. Her voice dropped to a venomous whisper meant only for me. I'm sorry, Alara, but I can't let him be deceived by you anymore. I scrambled away from her, my back hitting the leg of a chair. My vision blurred with tears, I turned my pleading eyes to Serafina and Alistair, who had come into the room drawn by the commotion. Mother? Father? My eyes screamed. Please. You know me. You know the truth. Serafina Thorne let out a long weary sigh. It was a sound of profound, unmistakable relief. It's for the best, Alara, she said, her voice crisp and final. We've long thought of you as a burden. A barren woman who can't even speak. You were never worthy of our son. The final betrayal. It was more devastating than Kaelin's coldness, more brutal than Clara's lies. These were the people for whom I had burned my youth, whose chamber pots I had emptied, whose aches and pains I had soothed. And they looked at me as if I were refused to be discarded. A sharp, crushing pain seized my chest. It was a physical manifestation of the heartbreak, a vice tightening around my heart. I gasped, clawing at my breastbone, my vision spotting. I looked up at the circle of faces surrounding me. Kaelin's disdain, Clara's pitying triumph, my in-laws' stony indifference. Not one of them moved to help me. Not one called for a doctor. I was already dead to them. As the darkness closed in, a final, crystalline clarity emerged. This was my end. This was the final logical conclusion of the choice I had made on that dusty path 5 years ago. But I would not go alone. If my life was the price for his, then he would pay it with me. With the last vestige of my strength, I lunged forward. I wrapped my arms around Kaelin's legs in a death grip, using my own falling weight to propel us both. We stumbled, crashed against the small table by the window, and then with a splintering of wood and a shatter of glass, we were falling. There was a brief, terrifying sensation of weightlessness, the wind whipping past my face, the ground rushing up to meet us. Kaelin's shout of surprise was the last thing I heard before the impact, and then, nothing. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent sunrise, all blazing light and searing pain. I was lying on my side, sharp gravel digging into my cheek. The world was too bright, the colors too vivid. The scent of jasmine and dust was overwhelming. For a disorienting moment I thought I was in some form of purgatory. Then a hand shoved me hard in the shoulder. Get out. This time I won't give you the chance to cling to me. The voice was younger, laced with a petulance I knew all too well. It was Kaelin. I pushed myself up, blinking against the sun. I was sitting on the edge of the dusty road. The same road. In front of me stood a younger, healthier Kaelin, cradling his right hand. On it, fresh and angry, were 2 familiar fang marks. The push had sent me sprawling. A sharp stone tore into my palm, the sting immediate and vivid. But the physical pain was a pinprick compared to the psychic shockwave that roared through me. The gravel under my nails was real. The heat of the sun on my neck was real. The panicked thumping of my heart was real. This was not a dream. This was not death. I was 20 years old again. It was the day of the exam. The day I had thrown my life away. I was reborn. Memories of my previous life, the sacrifice, the silence, the betrayal, the fall, flooded my mind, a searing torrent of regret and rage that threatened to drown me. I looked at Kaelin, at his handsome, scowling face, and a hatred so pure and so absolute filled me that I wanted to launch myself at him, to scratch his eyes out, to repay every moment of pain 100-fold. He saw the intensity in my glare and misunderstood, thinking I was still the desperate, love-struck girl frantic to save him. He immediately covered his wound with his other hand. "What are you still standing there for?" he sneered. I said, "I don't need you. Don't you understand human language?" Before I could form a coherent thought, process the miracle and the horror of my situation, Clara rushed forward. She half knelt, half crouched, grabbing Kaelin's unbitten left hand, her face a perfect mask of anguish. "Kaelin, what nonsense are you talking? How can you speak to Alara like that? Let her look at your wound. What if it really is a deadly snake? You could die." Kaelin, who had been furious moments before, softened at her touch. His voice grew gentle, a tone he had rarely if ever used with me. I know you're worried about me, Clara, but don't be. It's only a mildly venomous snake. I'll be fine. Besides, even if today I happen to be poisoned and die, I don't need someone as cruel and calculating as Alara to save me. The pieces clicked into place with terrifying finality. In my previous life, Clara had claimed the snake was harmless. Now Kalen was saying it himself. He knew. He knew it wasn't deadly. And his words, this time, cling to me, they weren't just the ramblings of a poisoned man. They were the words of someone who remembered. He too had been reborn. He had been given a second chance just as I had, and his first instinct was to reject me, to avoid the debt that had bound him to me. He was choosing Clara from the very beginning. A cold, calm clarity settled over me, smothering the initial inferno of rage. The frantic, love-struck girl I had been was gone, incinerated in the fall from that window. In her place was a woman who had already lived through the consequences of this moment. I looked at the wound on his hand. It was swelling, the skin around it already darkening, the telltale signs of necrosis beginning. It was not a mild bite. He was lying or he was a fool. Slowly, deliberately, I rose to my feet, brushing the dust from my clothes. The motion felt foreign, the body I inhabited younger, stronger, unbroken. He had said he didn't need me. He had spat the words in my face. Fine. I would grant him his wish. Fine, I said, and the sound of my own voice, my beautiful, whole, unbroken voice, rang clear and strong in the morning air. It was a sound I had not heard in 5 years. It was the sound of my freedom. Then I won't worry about it. I turned to leave. My satchel was on the ground. My admission ticket was inside. My future was waiting. Alara, you can't. Clara cried, her performance shifting up a gear. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Kalen is your fiancé, your future husband. You can't just ignore him. If you walk away, he could die. I found her theatrics both ridiculous and transparent. I looked at her hand on my arm, then back at her face. You've got it backwards, Clara, I said, my tone cool and measured. It's not that I don't want to save him. It's that the bitten person doesn't need me to save him. Am I supposed to risk my life forcing someone to be saved? Wouldn't that just demean myself? Clara looked flustered, her eyes darting behind me. What he's saying now is probably because he's been poisoned and isn't thinking straight. You shouldn't pick a fight with him. I let out a cold, sharp laugh. The sound startled both of them. Clara, I'm not a doctor. If you're sure he's been poisoned, you should take him to the hospital. Don't beg me. I don't know how to detoxify. I don't have any miracle remedy on me. She froze for a moment, her plan momentarily derailed. Then her eyes lit upon something behind me, and I heard the voices of villagers returning from their fields. Her sudden raise in volume now made sense. She had an audience. I know you're not a doctor, Alara, she said, projecting her voice for the newcomers. But you're Kalen's fiancé. You have to help him suck the venom out. Are you really going to stand there and watch Kalen die? He's the only college student in our region. The villagers, drawn by the drama, began to murmur. That's right, Alara, one of the men said, his tone censorious. He's your fiancé. At least try some first aid. A woman added, you can't just leave him even if he's a stranger. And he's your fiancé. If you really don't care, that's too harsh. Another voice, laced with suspicion, chimed in. Do you want to be the only one from here to go to college so you'd let your fiancé die on purpose? They were trying to corner me, to use public opinion as a cudgel to force me back into my old sacrificial role. But I was no longer their pawn. I was a player who knew the end of the game. I turned to face the small crowd, my expression shifting to one of pained reason and humiliation. You've misunderstood, I said, my voice trembling with just the right amount of hurt. Just now, I really did mean to give Kalen first aid, but he refused and said he'd rather die than have me help him. There's nothing I can do. Naturally, they were skeptical. Murmurs of impossible, and he wouldn't, rippled through them. I let out a faint, sad sigh, a masterpiece of feigned distress. At first, I also thought it was impossible, but now I understand. I paused, letting the suspense build. If I wanted to give Kalen first aid, there would inevitably have to be some physical contact. You all know I'm engaged to him. Normally, a little contact like that wouldn't matter. We're not living in some feudal society anymore. But he doesn't like me anymore. He's planning to break off our engagement and doesn't want anything to do with me. The crowd looked at one another, stunned. Kaylin and I were supposed to be the golden couple. I delivered the final blow, my voice dropping to a mortified whisper that still carried. Kaylin's heart has changed. The one he likes now is Clara. That's also why she's more anxious than I am. All eyes swiveled to where Clara still clutched Kaylin's hand. The intimate picture they made was all the confirmation the villagers needed. The mood shifted instantly from suspicion of me to scandalized judgment of them. Seeing Clara being publicly shamed, Kaylin's chivalry, or his possessiveness, ignited. He grabbed her hand protectively. Clara, don't belittle yourself like that. In my heart you're the best person. He looked at me and the crowd, his jaw set with a self-righteous anger. Today I'm going to say it clearly. I, Kaylin Thorne, want to break off my engagement with Alara Vance. The one I love is Clara. I've endured long enough. In fact, from the start I never liked you. I got engaged to you because you were a top student, your parents had died early, you were wealthy and easy to control. The gasps from the crowd were satisfying, but his next words were a gift I could never have anticipated, a public confession that severed his own lifeline. And another thing, he spat, eager to justify his cruelty and paint himself as the victim. Last year you didn't miss the college exam because of illness. It was because I fed you something that triggered your allergies. I knew you were smarter than me. I couldn't let you pass before I did. The revelation landed like a bomb. The village elder who had just arrived trembled with anger. Kaylin, you've gone too far. Everyone's expectations for you wasted. Flushed with rage and perhaps the advancing venom, Kaylin sneered at the elder, his city education making him arrogant. What do you people know, you bumpkins? Living with someone you don't love is torture every day. I'm a college student. What I do is none of your business. Get out of my sight. With that, the crowd dispersed in a wave of disgust and disappointment. Kaylin had just publicly destroyed his own reputation with his own words. He had cut off any chance of the village rallying to his aid. He had emancipated me in front of everyone. I didn't wait for the epilogue. As Kaylin, now dizzy, urged Clara to go take her exam, and as she insisted on taking him to the hospital first, I turned my back on them. I didn't look back. I bent down, picked up my satchel and brushed the dust from it. Then I walked away from the wreckage of my past life, my steps quick and sure towards the examination hall. This time I would not be late. This time the only life I would be saving was my own. The walk to the county town was a surreal pilgrimage. Every landmark was a ghost from a life I had already lived. The old oak tree where we'd had picnics, the stream where I'd washed clothes, the bend in the road that offered the first glimpse of the town's rooftops. Each one was layered with memories, both sweet and bitter. But the bitterness no longer had the power to wound me. It had been cauterized by the fire of my rebirth. I was not the same Alara who had walked this path with a heart full of love and anxiety. I was a revenant, a creature of vengeance and resolve, and my purpose was as sharp and clear as the pencils in my bag. I arrived at the examination hall with minutes to spare. The building, a stern brick structure, was surrounded by a throng of chattering, nervous students. I moved through them like a ship through a fog, my focus absolute. The ghost of my past self was here too. I could feel her. A frantic, tear-stained phantom rushing in the opposite direction, a man's dead weight on her back. I closed my eyes for a second, sending that ghost peace, and then walked through the heavy double doors. The room was vast and silent, filled with the scent of old wood, ink and sweat. Rows of wooden desks faced forward. I found my assigned seat, my heart pounding not with fear, but with a ferocious, almost holy purpose. The proctor passed out the papers, the rustle echoing like the turning of fate's page. I looked down at the first question, and I smiled. It wasn't that the questions were easy. It was that I had done them before. In my previous life, trapped in my silent, servile existence, my only solace had been my books. My mind, once sharp and hungry, had been a caged bird. Every year when the new national exam papers were published, I would get a copy. I would sit at my kitchen table long after the Thorns were asleep, the house silent except for the ticking of the clock, and I would work through every problem. I had written every essay, solved every equation, memorized every historical date. I had taken this damned exam, alone and in silence, over 20 times. The knowledge was etched into my mind by years of regret and disciplined repetition. The formulas, the literary analysis, the philosophical arguments. It all flowed from my pen as if guided by the ghost of my own lost potential. I worked methodically, carefully, the scratch of my nib the only sound in my world. I was not just taking a test. I was performing an exorcism. I was reclaiming a soul word by word, calculation by calculation. Each completed answer was a brick in the foundation of my new life. A life built not for someone else but for myself. Halfway through the allotted time I laid my pen down. I was finished. A quiet, profound satisfaction settled in my chest. But I wasn't careless. I wasn't overconfident. This was too precious. I spent the remaining hour meticulously checking my work, going over every character, every step of the logic. When the final bell rang, a sound that had haunted my dreams for years, I handed in my paper with a sense of profound, quiet finality. A chapter had closed. A new one was beginning. As I stepped out of the hall, blinking in the afternoon sun, the world seemed brighter, the colors more saturated. The chatter of other students washed over me, a sound of shared relief and anxiety. I suddenly remembered Clara. I scanned the crowd, but her familiar face was nowhere to be seen. She had never made it to the exam. A grim satisfaction settled in my stomach. It seemed her gallant rescue mission had taken longer than anticipated, or perhaps the consequences of her choice were already beginning to unfold. I didn't linger. I didn't rush back to the village to gawk. I went home, to my home, the small, sturdy cottage my parents had left me, which I had so foolishly abandoned to live with the Thorns after the wedding. It was dusty and quiet, filled with the ghosts of my childhood, but it was mine. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I slept a dreamless, peaceful sleep, lulled by the silence that was now a comfort, not a prison. The next few days were a blissful, stolen interlude. I tended my overgrown garden, the feel of the earth on my hands a grounding, joyful sensation. I read books for pleasure, not for escape. I cooked simple meals for one and savored the sound of my own voice humming in the empty rooms. The peace was a fragile thing and I knew it wouldn't last. The storm I had walked away from was still brewing, and it would inevitably seek me out. The knocking, when it came, was frantic, imperious. I opened the door to find Seraphina and Alistair Thorne, their faces pale and twisted with a panic that was undercut by the habitual anger they directed at me. "There you are." Seraphina shrieked, her voice shrill. "Where have you been hiding? Something terrible has happened to Kaylin. Come with us to the hospital now." I feigned wide-eyed confusion and concern. I said nothing, simply nodded and followed them. I had no intention of helping, but I had every intention of witnessing the consequences of their son's choices and of Clara's inaction. The county hospital smelled of antiseptic and despair, a smell I knew all too well. We arrived just as Kaylin was being wheeled out of the operating room. He was unconscious, his skin a sickly gray wax. But he was alive. My eyes went immediately to his right arm. Or rather, to the heavily bandaged stump where his right arm used to be, the sleeve of the hospital gown pinned neatly over it. So that was it. The venom, left to its own devices, had done its destructive work. He had chosen a path that led directly to this moment. His mother wailed, a raw, animal sound of grief, and threw herself at the surgeon. "What's wrong with my son? What have you done to him?" The doctor, a tired-looking man with kind eyes, patiently extracted his arm from her grip. "Ma'am, I understand how you feel, but I have to explain clearly. Your son was bitten by a highly venomous snake. In theory, if he had received immediate first aid, suction, a tight bandage, and been brought here quickly, we might have saved the limb. However, he received no treatment, arrived late, and the physical exertion of the journey accelerated the venom's spread through his system. The tissue necrosis was too severe, right down to the bone. We had to perform an emergency amputation to save his life." His mother nearly fainted. Alistair caught her, his own face ashen. Then, as if on a shared silent cue, both of them turned to glare at me, their eyes full of a venom more potent than any snake's. Before they could speak, Clara emerged from a shadowed corner, her face streaked with tears, her dress stained and rumpled. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her performance beginning anew. "It's all because of her. It's Alara's fault. She did this to Kaylin." I didn't flinch. I simply looked at her, my gaze cool and steady, a rock against which her hysteria broke. "Clara, how can you spout nonsense like that? Maybe you two don't know, she cried, turning to the thorns, playing to her intended audience. This morning we ran into Kalen. He was already bitten. And Alara, she just abandoned him and went to take her exam. If I hadn't brought him here, he might have. She didn't need to finish. Serafina and Alistair, desperate for a target for their pain and rage, had found their villain. They descended on me, their fingers jabbing the air like daggers. You wretched girl. Alistair roared. How could you? He's your husband. His arm is gone because of you. You will pay for this. You will take responsibility. I let their vulgar insults wash over me. I had heard worse in another life and had been unable to respond. Now I waited until they paused for breath, their faces purple with exertion. So after all this fuss, I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the hospital corridor's hush, it's just about my money, isn't it? I looked from one to the other, my expression one of pure contempt. You have no shame. Kalen is your son, not mine. Why should I be the one to pay? The shock on their faces was priceless. I had never ever talked back to them before. I had been the silent, obedient daughter-in-law. To tell the truth, I continued, my tone calm and conversational, I don't intend to pay this bill. I don't even need to explain myself, but I will make something clear. As I ran into Kalen. He was bitten. And he firmly, explicitly refused to let me help him. He said he'd rather die than have me save him. He said he loved Clara. So if you want someone to blame, look to the one he chose. Look to the one who was with him, who held his hand and had every opportunity to suck the venom out herself but didn't. The responsibility isn't mine. I turned and pointed directly at Clara, who took a step back. It's hers. Clara froze, her eyes wide. What does this have to do with me? I don't know anything about snakes. I was the one who brought him here. His condition was this serious, I pressed, my voice even and relentless. On the way here he must have been short of breath, dizzy, fading in and out. Right, Clara? She hesitated, caught in the trap, then nodded, playing the brave martyr. Yes. It was terrible. I had to struggle, I had to support him the whole way. If it hadn't been for me. If it hadn't been for you not sucking the venom out immediately, I interrupted, my voice rising to a clear, carrying pitch, he wouldn't have lost his arm. Isn't that right? The trap snapped shut. Are you crazy? She blurted out, her mask of self-sacrifice slipping completely to reveal the selfish core beneath. If I had sucked it, I'd have been poisoned myself. Silence. Absolute, dead silence in the hallway. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror, but it was too late. The truth was out. She had valued her own safety, her own comfort, over Kalen's limb. Over his future. The thorn's fury, so recently directed at me, swiveled and descended upon Clara with the force of a hurricane. Serafina lunged at her, screaming, "You selfish little witch! You let my son be crippled." Alistair was right behind her, his shouts adding to the din. As they descended into a chaotic, screaming scuffle, nurses rushing to intervene, I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. The sound of their chaos, the proof of their own rotten foundations crumbling, was the sweetest music I had heard in either of my lifetimes. I walked out of the hospital, out of their drama, and into the clean, free air of my own reclaimed future. The following week, the village was a ferment of gossip. I was its calm, quiet epicenter, staying within the sanctuary of my own home, tending my garden and waiting. I knew they would come. A lifetime of entitlement, once granted, is a weed with deep roots, and the thorns were not gardeners, they were blight. They would not accept their fate quietly. They needed a scapegoat, a caretaker, a source of funds. I was in their eyes, all three. They arrived on a Tuesday morning, a pathetic, grim procession. Alistair and Serafina, looking older and more haggard than I had ever seen them, pushing a wheelchair. In it sat Kalen, pale and shrunken, his face a hollow mask, the empty right sleeve of his shirt a stark visual proclamation of his new reality. They positioned their tragic tableau directly at my gate and began their performance. "Everyone, come look," Serafina wailed, her voice cracking with practiced grief. "Help us get justice. This girl Alara, she's not even human. She ruined our son. She made him lose an arm. How is he supposed to live now? How will he go to school?" A crowd gathered, as villagers do, drawn by the spectacle. The whispers began, a susurrus of sympathy for the thorns and morbid curiosity about my role in the tragedy. I stood just inside my door listening, letting them paint their picture. "We don't want her in jail," Alistair declared, his voice booming with a theatrical magnanimity that fooled no one who knew him. "We are not vengeful people. We only want her to understand she's wrong, to apologize, to admit her mistake, and from now on, to take care of our son for life. Our health is poor. Kaylin needs someone. We know you took the exam and will likely pass, but you can't go to school. You have to stay. And the money your parents left you, hand it over. Our son needs it for his treatment and his future." The audacity was so breathtaking it was almost admirable. They were not asking, they were demanding. They saw my future, my inheritance, my very body as their rightful property, forfeit due to a crime I did not commit. I felt no anger, only a cold, clear contempt. I opened my door and stepped out into the morning light. The crowd fell silent. I ignored the Thorns' demands and walked straight up to Kaylin's wheelchair. I crouched down so our eyes were level. His gaze was empty, defeated, the fire of his rebirth and his arrogance completely extinguished. "Why are there only 3 of you here?" I asked softly, my voice carrying in the quiet. "Where's your true love? Didn't Clara come?" He glanced at me, then away, saying nothing. A muscle twitched in his jaw. His mother exploded. "Don't mention that, Jinx. That treacherous little snake. If she hadn't refused to suck the venom, my son wouldn't be like this. He's at fault too." She interfered, and then she ran away and hid like the coward she is. "Now who knows where she's skulking?" I nodded slowly as if considering this. "In that case," I said, my voice cold and logical, "if you think it's her fault, go find her. Demand responsibility from her. Why come to me?" Alistair sputtered, his face turning red. "She may be at fault, but she isn't his fiancée. You are. As his fiancée, you should have risked your life for your future husband. Since you didn't, the blame lies with you. Stop trying to shift the blame." Serafina shrieked, lurching forward to clutch at my hand with bony, desperate fingers. "Today, you must come with us to register the marriage and take care of Kaylin for the rest of your life." I looked at Kaylin. He offered no objection, his spirit seemingly broken beyond repair. I yanked my hand free from Serafina's grasp as if her touch were unclean. "Ma'am," I said, my voice ringing clear and firm for the whole crowd to hear. "This is modern society. No one can be forced into marriage. When Kaylin was bitten, I tried to save him. He refused. He said he wanted to break off the engagement. There are witnesses. The village chief was there. How can it be that when he was healthy he wanted to annul the engagement, but now that he's disabled the blame is thrown on me?" I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the assembled villagers, meeting their eyes one by one. I am not a scrap collector taking in broken things. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The village chief, drawn by the commotion, stepped forward and confirmed my story. "Mr. and Mrs. Thorn, you can't be unreasonable. A snake bite is an accident. It has nothing to do with Alara. Dimitri himself refused her help. If she had insisted, she would only have demeaned herself. You are bringing shame upon yourselves." The crowd's sympathy shifted instantly. "We blamed her wrongly," someone said loudly. "This is their own doing." Another added, "They just want her money and a free nursemaid." The Thorns, enraged and humiliated, grew more desperate. Their logic, always tenuous, now completely unraveled. "Even if my son said he didn't want you to save him, you still shouldn't have left him." Serafina screamed, her voice cracking. "If he loves someone else, that's because you couldn't keep his heart. That only means you should save him, marry him, and win his love back." It was a statement so absurd, so divorced from reason that the crowd gasped. It was then that Kaylin finally spoke. "Enough," he said, his voice a raw, shredded whisper. "Stop arguing." All eyes turned to him. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a complex mix of pain and a dawning, horrifying realization. "What Alara and the chief said is all true. I did refuse her help. Mom, Dad, stop making trouble." He took a shaky breath, his gaze fixed on me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in either lifetime. "Alara, I'm not the kind of man who refuses to admit when he's wrong. This time I was truly wrong. I misunderstood your intentions. I always thought you were saving me not because I was in danger, but because you wanted to marry me. That's why I rejected you. But now I understand. You knew my condition was dangerous, and your refusal to save me was simply letting me bear the consequences of my own choices." He ground his teeth, a flicker of his old pride surfacing. I've received my retribution. You must be appeased now, right? I blinked, feigning utter confusion. Kalen Thorne, what are you even saying? I don't understand a word of this. He hesitated, then forced the words out, a desperate last-ditch attempt to reassert control. I've already apologized. They say a prodigal son who returns is worth more than gold. So, I want to rekindle what we had. I want to marry you. Once we're married, I'll treat you well. I'll let you go to college. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it left me speechless for a moment. Then a laugh, cold and sharp and utterly devoid of warmth, escaped my lips. A prodigal son returning is worth more than gold? Do you really think you're some kind of treasure? College is something I'll pursue if I want to, not because you let me. And aside from the fact that you've now lost an arm, just your own admissions, that you never loved me, that you stayed with me for my money, that you made me miss last year's exam, are enough for me to hate you for the rest of my life. How could I possibly rekindle anything with you? I took a step back, my voice firm and final, a judgment delivered. I, Ilara Vance, would rather stay single for the rest of my life than have anything to do with a man like you. The rejection shattered the last of his composure. The mask of contrition fell away, revealing the bewildered, entitled boy beneath. How can this be? He stammered, truly baffled. You loved me so much. You risked your life for me. You became mute. You wore yourself out for me and my parents. How can you say you won't marry me? In this life I haven't cheated. I haven't done anything with Clara yet. How can you refuse? Then his eyes widened with a terrifying, desperate clarity. Unless you've been reborn too. You remember the past life. You remember I cheated with Clara. You remember I didn't trust you. So now you hate me. But that was all in the previous life. In this life I haven't done anything yet. And besides, in the last life, it was you who caused my death. Even if you were reborn, you should feel guilty toward me, not resentful. How can you still hate me? The crowd fell into a stunned, bewildered silence. Reincarnation? Past lives? They stared at him as if he had grown a second head. The venom they clearly thought had addled his brain. I didn't confirm or deny it. I simply laughed again, a sound of pure, unadulterated scorn. You must still have snake venom in your brain. You're talking nonsense. I turned to his horrified parents. Sir, ma'am, I think you'd better take Kalen to a psychiatric hospital. Don't let a madman run around outside embarrassing you further. The crowd, released from its shock, erupted in nervous laughter. The spell was broken. The Thorns, mortified beyond endurance, hurriedly scolded their raving son and began to wheel him away, his desperate, fading pleas about past lives marking their retreat. I turned, walked back into my house and slid the heavy wooden bolt shut. The solid thunk was the closing of a tomb on my old life. It was over. In the days that followed, a profound quiet settled over my life. The Thorns did not return. The siege had been broken, their power over me and the court of public opinion utterly destroyed. I was free. The knowledge was a physical sensation, a lightness in my chest, an ease in my breathing I hadn't known was possible. I spent my days in productive solitude, preparing for the future I was now certain awaited me. My acceptance letter arrived on a day of soft summer rain. It was from the University of the North, a prestigious institution far from the shadow of these mountains and their painful memories. I held the thick, creamy paper in my hands, tracing the embossed seal with my finger, and I wept, not tears of sorrow but of pure, undiluted vindication. It was real. It was mine. The village grapevine, however, never rests. I learned that the Thorns' fury, with no other outlet, had shifted entirely onto Clara Carter and her family. Having lost their primary target, me, they needed someone to blame, to punish, to pay. They became a constant, wailing presence outside the Carter household, a living embodiment of accusation. They demanded compensation for Kalen's lost arm, for his ruined future. They screamed that Clara was a murderer by inaction, that she had seduced their son and led him to ruin. The Carters, initially defensive, soon found their resolve crumbling under the relentless assault. Clara's father was a proud man, but he was not equipped to handle the daily theatricals of grief and rage the Thorns performed on his doorstep. The social pressure became immense. Their daughter was now a pariah, the other woman who had let a man be crippled. No other family would consider her for marriage. Her future was as ashes. I heard the stories from a neighbor who took a morbid delight in keeping me informed. They negotiated for days, she said, her eyes wide. It was like a business deal. The Thorns wanted money, of course, but more than that, they wanted a caretaker for Kalen. They said Clara had ruined him so she could damned well look after him. A deal was struck. The details were murky, but the outcome was clear. The Carters agreed to the marriage. It was a transaction pure and simple. They would provide a small dowry, and in exchange the Thorns would take their soiled daughter off their hands, and the public harassment would cease. Clara's future was being traded for peace. I decided I would attend the wedding. Not out of malice, though God knows I felt plenty, but out of a need for closure. I needed to see the final nail in the coffin of my past life, to witness the two architects of my destruction bind themselves together in the miserable union they had so desperately schemed for. I dressed with deliberate care. I chose a simple but elegant dress of deep emerald green, a color that spoke of life and renewal, a stark contrast to the funeral I knew this wedding would be. I arrived at the sparse village registry office just as the small, grim party was assembling. Kalen was in his wheelchair, dressed in a suit that hung loosely on his gaunt frame. He looked like a ghost propped up for a photograph. Clara stood beside him, wearing a plain cream-colored dress that did nothing for her pallid complexion. There was no bouquet, no smile, no light in her eyes. There was only a stony resignation, the look of someone who has accepted a life sentence. When I entered, Kalen's eyes, dull and lifeless, found me. For a fleeting second, they lit up with a pathetic, desperate hope. He must have thought I had come to stop the wedding, to rescue him from this fate, to fulfill the role of the ever-devoted Alara one last time. How little he understood the woman I had become. I walked up to them, a small, polite, utterly impersonal smile on my face. "Congratulations to you both," I said, my voice clear and sweet, devoid of any discernible emotion. "May you have 100 years of happiness." His face fell, the hope extinguished, replaced by a profound, weary despair. He looked away into the middle distance, surrendering completely. Clara's face, however, tightened. Though she lifted her chin in a show of pride, her voice was brittle, defensive. "Marrying Kalen is something I'm willing to do, Alara," she said, that old, familiar smugness trying to break through her misery. "Don't think you'll get to laugh at me and him. Even if he's lost an arm now, so what? He's still a college student and I'm still the wife of a college student. People will still envy me." She leaned slightly closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "In fact, this is even better. At least now I don't have to worry about him getting angry or betraying me." I looked at her, at this young woman who had traded her youth, her freedom, for a hollow title and the care of a broken, resentful man. She was consigning herself to a life of bitterness and servitude, and she was trying to paint it as a victory. She didn't yet understand that the snake's venom was a patient poison. It wasn't finished with Kalen Thorn. I didn't enlighten her. I simply smiled, a genuine, serene smile that seemed to confuse her. "I'm sure you'll be very happy together," I said, and I meant it. They deserved every single moment of the future they had chosen for themselves. They were perfectly matched. I left before the brief, joyless ceremony began. I had seen all I needed to see. The scales were balanced. The players were in place on their grim new board. My work here was done. I walked away from the registry office, the emerald green of my dress a splash of vibrant life against the drab backdrop of the village, and I did not look back. Stepping onto the campus of the University of the North was like being born into a new world. The air itself felt different, charged with intellectual energy, thick with the promise of 1,000 different futures. The grand, ancient buildings of stone and ivy, the bustling walkways filled with students from every corner of the country, the lively debates overheard in coffee shops and under trees. It was a universe away from the petty, suffocating confines of my village. For a moment, standing at the main gates with my single worn suitcase, I was overwhelmed by a wave of imposter syndrome. What was a girl from the mountains, a twice-lived tragedy, doing in a place like this? Then I remembered the feel of gravel on my cheek, the sound of my own broken whisper, the crushing weight of Kalen's body on my back. I remembered the fall. I squared my shoulders, lifted my chin, and walked in. I found my dormitory, a sparse but clean room I would share with 3 other girls. They were bright, chatty, full of stories of their homes and dreams of their futures. I listened, I smiled, I offered vague answers about my own past. I was Alara Vance from the southern foothills. My parents were deceased. I was here to study. That was all they needed to know. The girl who had been sacrificed, betrayed, and reborn was a story too fantastical to tell. When the door clicked shut behind me that first night, leaving me alone in the quiet, the reality of it finally hit. I was here. I had done it. I had wrested my destiny from the jaws of fate and carved a new path with my own two hands. I sank onto the narrow bed and let the tears flow. Tears of relief, of joy, of grief for the life I had lost, and of fierce, blazing triumph for the life I had seized back. I threw myself into my studies with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. While my classmates went to parties and explored the city, I was in the library, often the first to arrive and the last to leave. While they gossiped in the halls, I was in lecture halls, soaking up every word, engaging in debates, my mind once caged now soaring. My past life had taught me the preciousness of time and opportunity in a way none of my peers could comprehend. I would not waste a single second. This was not just an education. It was my resurrection. I chose to major in economics. It was a field of power, of logic, of building and controlling systems. I would never again be at the mercy of someone else's financial whims or be valued for my inheritance. I would understand the machinery of the world and I would make it work for me. I rarely went back to the village. When I did, for the brief winter and summer breaks, I kept to my cottage, avoiding the main thoroughfares. The village gossip, however, has a long reach, and it found me even in my seclusion. The news came in snippets from the same neighbor who seemed to have appointed herself the town crier of misfortune. It started predictably. Clara had accompanied Kalen back to the city as his caretaker. At first things were manageable if bleak. But then the long-term effects of the venom, which had been held at bay by the immediate amputation, began to surface in other, more insidious ways. Kalen started having episodes. The brilliant mind, once his pride, began to fracture. He experienced hallucinations, vivid and terrifying. He suffered from paranoia, convinced his professors were plotting against him, that his classmates were laughing at him. The most damning symptom, the one that sealed their fate, was his confusion of timelines. He could no longer distinguish between the previous life and the present one. In his mind, Clara was me and I was Clara. He would accuse her of trying to poison him, of deliberately making him miss his exams, of being a barren, mute burden. The beatings began. At first they were shoves, slaps. Then they grew worse. Clara, who had married him for status and a perverse sense of victory, found herself the prisoner of a deteriorating, abusive husband. She endured it for a while, playing the martyr, but the reality was a far cry from the enviable life of a professor's wife she had imagined. The status she craved evaporated as Kalen was first put on academic probation, then asked to leave the university entirely. He was no longer a college student. He was a disabled, mentally unstable man with a violent temper. She couldn't take it anymore. She never fought back, but she chose to run. She packed a bag and fled their rented room while he was in one of his stupors. But Kalen, in his fractured state, realized she was gone and flew into a rage. He chased after her, his mind a storm of past and present betrayals. The exertion, the rage, the poison still lingering in his system. It was too much for his damaged heart. He collapsed in a back alley, unnoticed. No one realized he was missing for days. A landlord, concerned about the unpaid rent, went to his room. He found Kalen Thorne on the floor, cold and stiff. He had been dead for at least 3 days. The official cause was heart failure, complicated by systemic toxicity from the old snake venom. The news, when it reached the village, nearly killed his parents from shock. Grief-stricken and vengeful, they blamed Clara. They lay in wait for her outside the Carter family home, where she had returned in shame. Old grudges and new hatred erupted at once. The details were murky, told in hushed, horrified tones. There was a fight, a struggle near the well. Some said Alistair had a knife, others said Serafina pushed her. The end result was the same. The Thornes and Clara Carter were all dead. A tragedy of mutual destruction, a fire that consumed everyone it touched. I stood in my quiet kitchen, listening to the neighbor recount the tale with macabre relish, and I felt a profound, echoing silence. No schadenfreude, no sense of victory. Just a vast, empty stillness. The nightmare that had haunted 2 of my lifetimes was finally, truly over. The villains had not been struck down by my hand, but by the inescapable consequences of their own choices, their own greed, their own poison. The universe had balanced its own books. They were gone. And I was free. Truly, completely free. With the ghosts of my past finally laid to rest, my life began in earnest. I graduated at the top of my class, my name spoken with respect by esteemed professors and ambitious peers alike. The mute, barren girl from the mountains was now Alara Vance, BA in economics with first-class honors, with a future shimmering with a potential that was entirely my own. I took a job in the capital, a vibrant modern city a world away from the shadows of the foothills. I found a small, sunlit apartment and filled it with books, with plants, with the quiet peace I had craved for so long. I built a life for myself, a deliberate, orderly life. I made a few careful friends, intelligent, independent women who knew nothing of my history. We discussed politics, literature, and our careers. I learned to enjoy my own solitude, to cherish the sound of my own laughter echoing in the empty rooms. It was not a lonely sound. It was the sound of wholeness. I never married. The scars Kaylin and the thorns had left were not the kind that healed enough to allow for that kind of vulnerability. The very idea of tying my life, my hard-won freedom, my identity, to another person felt like a betrayal of the self I had fought so desperately to save. I had been a possession, a tool, a symbol. I would never be that again. My life was my own sovereign nation and I was its sole citizen and ruler. But I was not lonely. I was complete. One bright spring afternoon, years into my new life, I was walking through the city's Central Park. The cherry blossoms were in full, riotous bloom, a confetti of pink against the clear blue sky. I saw a young couple on a blanket, their heads close together, laughing. A little girl, maybe 3 years old, with chubby legs and a mass of dark curls, was chasing a butterfly, her giggles floating on the breeze like music. A familiar old ache bloomed in my chest, the loss of the children I would never have. It was a deep, hollow pain, the ghost of a motherhood that had been stolen from me twice over. But for the first time, the ache was not accompanied by despair or bitterness. It was just a part of me, a scar among many, a quiet, sad space that existed alongside the joy and fulfillment I had built. It was a reminder of the price I had paid for the life I now lived, a life I would not trade for anything. I had thought for a long time that my story was one of revenge. A tale of cosmic payback, of villains getting their just desserts. But as I watched that family, their faces turned up to the sun, their laughter unforced and full of love, I realized it was not. Revenge was a passive outcome, a side effect of their own moral decay. My story was one of reclamation. I had reclaimed my voice, my mind, my future, my very soul from those who sought to bury it under a mountain of obligation, lies, and borrowed dreams. The path had been paved with pain and fire, but it had led me here, to this moment of quiet contentment, to this unshakable knowledge of my own worth, independent of any other person. I had not just survived, I had transformed. The fire that had consumed my first life had forged me into something stronger, something unbreakable. I turned from the happy family and continued my walk, the sun warm on my face, the path stretching out before me. The past was a closed book, its lessons learned, its ghosts pacified. The future was an open road, winding into a horizon I was eager to explore on my own terms. And I, Alara Vance, was finally, unequivocally and joyously free to walk it alone. The end.